Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've been able to grab some lunch. Lunch is over there, if you could grab and sit down before our keynote. And my name is Juliana Makochi-Fabenyi. I'm one of the co-chairs of the symposium with Karen Holbrands, who talked to you this morning. She's right there. It is really my pleasure to see that our Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost is here, and I want to welcome him to the podium and thank him for coming to the event so that he can come and introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you, Provost Arden.
Thank you, Juliana, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you. So I am honored to be here to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Raj Shetty, who will deliver an address entitled Improving Equality of Opportunity in America, New Insights from Big Data. Dr. Chetty is the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard and Director of Opportunity Insights. His research combines empirical evidence and economic theory to help design more effective government policies. His work on tax policy, unemployment insurance, and education has been widely cited in the media and in congressional testimony. His current research focuses on equality of opportunity. How can we give children from disadvantaged backgrounds a chance of succeeding? His work is widely cited in academia and media outlets, and his citation metrics place him among the most influential social scientists alive. His most widely cited work is titled, Where is the Land of Opportunity? The Geography of Intergenerational Mobility in the United States. Dr. Chetty earned his baccalaureate from Harvard in 3 years, and his PhD 3 years later, in 2003, at the age of 23. And he was offered a tenure-track position at Berkeley. He earned tenure at the age of 28 and became one of the youngest tenured professors in the history of Harvard's economics department. His work has been quoted tens of thousands of times and has received numerous awards and grants, including the Young Labor Economist Award from the Institute for the Study of Labor, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, the John Bates Clark Medal, given by the American Economic Association to the best American economist under age 40, and the Padma Shri Award for distinguished service in any field by the Government of India. Dr. Chetty was elected a member of the National Academy of Sciences in 2018, and he launched Opportunity Insights in that year, a project that uses big data to understand how income, taxation, and social opportunity influence the chances of success in America. He's provided congressional testimony to inform public policy and legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Raj Shetty.
Thanks so much, Provost Arden, for the very warm introduction. I wish I could be there with you all in person today, but unfortunately, public health conditions made that difficult. But it's a privilege and an honor to get a chance to speak with you, at least remotely. So what I'm going to do here is share some slides, and hopefully you're going to be able to see this. I hope that's working. Please tell me if not. And so what I'm going to talk about today is improving economic opportunity in America, drawing on big data, as Provost Arden mentioned, which is the focus of our team. And I'm going to focus specifically on how we can make changes in our own communities, in our own institutions, showing you data from North Carolina in particular on how I think we can have an impact on improving economic opportunity for all of our kids. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which is, of course, a multifaceted, complex concept that can mean different things to different people. But I want to distill it to a simple statistic that we can measure systematically in the data, which is the fraction of kids who go on to earn more than their parents did. So traditionally, if you look at the historical discussions in the United States, the way people talk about the American dream, one key aspect of it at least, is that this is a country where we aspire to be a place where through hard work, any child would have the chance to go on to have a higher standard of living than their parents did. Because certainly that sort of notion that drew my own parents, who are immigrants from India, to come to the United States. And so in a paper my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which the US actually lives up to that aspiration. Do lots of kids actually go on to earn more than their parents did? And how is that true today? And how does that compare to how things were in the past? And so what we're doing in this first chart here is plotting the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And we're looking at this data by the year in which the child was born. So starting on the far left here, with children who were born back in 1940, where you can see that it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream. 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. Then if you look at how this trend has evolved over time, you see a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the 1980s who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's now become basically a coin flip, a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. So this dramatic trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the US economy that we would like to understand. But I would argue it's also a fundamental social and political interest because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead. And that is reflected in political outcomes and various other outcomes that we're grappling with in this country. So motivated by this broad trend, in our research and policy group here at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, we're focused on the very big picture question of what is driving the fading of the American dream and how can we restore the American dream going forward? What types of policy changes can make a difference in giving kids of all backgrounds, and particularly kids from lower income families, chances of rising up? Now, there are lots of people who are studying issues related to these issues and who've made progress on thinking about these issues over decades. Social scientists have been interested in questions of inequality and opportunity for a long time, and we're by no means the first to study these problems. What is our angle on it? In our group, we're specifically focused on using the tools of big data to study these questions. So you all hear a lot about big data in the context of the private sector these days, companies like Amazon and Google improving the products they offer through the use of large data sets. Analogously, our vision is that large data sets can help us better understand critical economic and social policy questions, in this case, how to increase upward mobility. Now, anytime you start from vast data sets covering the entire population, I'll start to describe these data in more detail in a second, you have to have some angle of entry, some way you're going to organize that data to study the question. Often the way researchers study these questions is to focus on one particular topic. So for instance, in the context of inequality, it would be very natural to focus on issues of education. And I am going to talk about education as one potential key lever to increase upward mobility. But there are going to be many other aspects of potential policy domains that could matter, ranging from affordable housing to social capital, that also seem to play into this picture. And so the way we're going to organize things is, rather than focusing on a specific topic, look at a life course perspective from childhood to adulthood, think about a broad range of interventions that could matter in increasing upward mobility. The starting point for a lot of our work is the observation that there are very sharp local geographic differences in rates of upward mobility. So that national chart that I started out with turns out to mask lots of differences across different parts of the United States, different parts of cities within the US. So let me dive into the data and show that to you by turning to this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility in the United States. So what I'm going to do is first describe how we construct this map, and then I'll talk about what I think we learned from it. So what we did is took data on about 20 million kids drawn from anonymous tax and census records, and we linked those kids to their parents' information and back to where they were born. And using that data, we construct measures of upward mobility for each part of the United States. So specifically what we're doing here is dividing the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we're taking the set of kids who grew up in that area and computing a very simple measure of upward mobility. What is the average income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families? That is, families earning about $27,000 a year, putting them at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. We color the map so that blue-green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility, where kids starting out in these low-income families reach higher up in the income distribution. And red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. If you start by looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this map, you can see that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up across different parts of the US. So in the darkest blue colors, for example, much of the rural Midwest, places like Dubuque, Iowa, kids growing up in low-income families, they're on average, one generation later, earning about $45,000 a year or $50,000 a year. So really substantial amount of upward mobility, starting from 27,000 to almost twice that amount one generation later. In contrast, if you look at other places like Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, kids starting out in families at the exact same income level, $27,000 a year, one generation later are actually doing no better than their parents on average. In fact, slightly worse in terms of household income. And more broadly, if you look, in much of the Southeast, the industrial Midwest, and other parts of the United States, you see much lower levels of upward mobility in certain areas. So this map here, as the provost noted, has animated a lot of discussion in the US and a lot of research by our team and many others to basically try to understand why we're seeing so many, such large differences in economic mobility across areas. Why is that question interesting? Well, first, from a scientific perspective, it gives us a new lens, if you will, a new sort of microscope to understand the science of economic opportunity. If I can figure out what's going on that's different in Salt Lake City or San Francisco compared to Charlotte or Cleveland, then maybe I can start to understand what the key drivers of economic mobility are. And why is that then useful from a policy perspective? I can potentially take those lessons and figure out how we might be able to replicate some of the favorable conditions in some of these places in other areas that currently have lower levels of upward mobility, thereby increasing economic opportunity throughout the United States. So that big kind of logic and program has animated a lot of the work our research team has been focused on. And what I'd like to share with you in the course of the next 20 minutes or so is what we've learned from trying to investigate what drives the differences in economic mobility that we're seeing in this map. And the way that I'm going to structure this is basically the process of scientific inquiry, coming up with different hypotheses. You probably have a few in your mind already as candidate explanations for what might be driving this variation. I'm going to systematically try to assess whether those explanations are correct and try to give you a sense of what we've learned about the science of economic opportunity from this analysis. And then finally, I'll take those lessons and talk about what they mean for policy on the ground, what types of changes could actually increase upward mobility going forward. So the first explanation that many people think of when they see this map, at least economists, is that maybe there are differences in the labor markets in these different areas, differences in the types of jobs that are available in different places that are giving people chances to rise up that are better in some areas than others. So to take an example, you might think of San Francisco Bay Area. We all know the tech sector has been booming. Maybe there's a high level of upward mobility there because lots of people who grow up there get those high-paying tech jobs. Now, to assess that, what we do here is take the measures of upward mobility that I was showing you on the map previously, here shown for the 30 largest metro areas in the US, and plot them against job growth rates from 1990 to 2010, roughly the period when kids in the sample we're looking at who were born in the early 1980s, roughly the time when they were growing up. And what you can see when you look at the relationship between these two variables is that basically there is no relationship. This basically looks like a cloud. So in particular, you have cities like Charlotte, which has one of the highest rates of job growth in the United States. So I'm sure you're all familiar. Charlotte and much of North Carolina is doing extremely well from a traditional economic perspective. If you were to look at average incomes, the number of jobs, high-paying jobs, on all of those measures, Charlotte in particular and much of North Carolina would look terrific. But when you look at these data, if you look at the vertical axis, you look at rates of upward income mobility for low-income kids growing up in Charlotte. Charlotte actually ranks 50th out of the 50 largest cities in America in terms of rates of upward mobility for low-income kids growing up there. So what that simple point shows you is that there can be a pretty serious disconnect between having very high rates of job growth, like Charlotte and Atlanta do, and rates of upward mobility for the low-income kids growing up in a given place. So you might ask, how is that possible? How can it just add up that you have average incomes going up very sharply in Charlotte? If you drive around the city, you can see that it's booming. Yet, when you look at these data, it's telling you that when you follow kids over time, the kids who were born in Charlotte and grow up there in low-income families aren't doing all that well. How are those two things consistent with each other? Well, the way I think about it is that basically cities like Charlotte and Atlanta are importing talent. Lots of people, it turns out, move to Charlotte and Atlanta, Raleigh as well, to get high-paying jobs. But they are growing up, particularly if they come from low-income families, in other parts of the United States. And so as a result, you have these booming economies that are not necessarily bringing up the kids growing up in disadvantaged families in those environments themselves. So that's lesson number one. This is not just about differences in economic growth across places. That's useful to understand itself from a policy perspective, because it means that simply trying to get big employers to your area, like bidding to get the Amazon headquarters, is not in and of itself going to increase rates of upward mobility for kids growing up in low-income families in your city. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be the key in terms of explaining what's going on. So let's come back to the big map here and think about a second potential explanation. Anyone familiar with the racial demographics of the United States would recognize that there's a potential connection to race here. In particular, the areas with larger African-American populations, like the Southeast, cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, and so forth, tend to be the ones that are in the red and orange colors on this map. Now, we all know that there's a long history of racial disparities in the United States and discrimination going back hundreds of years. And so it wouldn't be a surprise then to know that there are significant differences in upward mobility by race. And so you might wonder how much of what we're seeing in this map is really about differences by race and the racial segregation of the US, rather than differences by place, that is, the causal effects of place for people of a given race. So to disentangle that and understand the role of race more clearly, I'm going to turn to this pair of maps here, which replicate what I was showing you before, but separately now for Black men on the left and white men on the right. Now, when you look at these two maps initially, your initial reaction might be, well, they put these two maps on two different color scales, kind of a red-orange color scale on the left and a blue-green color scale on the right. But in fact, if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see that we have not. The maps are on the same color scale. It's just that there is such an extreme difference in rates of upward mobility between Black men and white men that it's almost like they're living in two different countries, like they're two separate Americas in terms of economic opportunity for Black men and white men. So in particular, what's going on here is that the places with the very highest levels of upward mobility for Black men, like Boston, for example, they have lower levels of upward mobility than the places with the lowest levels of upward mobility for white men. So for example, a place like Charlotte, where white men who grow up in low-income families have average incomes of only $25,000 a year as adults. And so it's essentially like they're two disjoint distributions, two completely different sets of opportunities by race. So bottom line, there's no understating the importance of race, even conditional on class. So I want to emphasize, we're again taking a set of kids who are starting out at the same economic level. They're all starting out in families earning $27,000 a year. Using detailed information from tax records, we're taking kids who grew up in comparable economic circumstances, but we're still finding that race has enormous importance, conditional on socioeconomic class. So you'll notice here, I focus specifically on data for men, comparing Black men to white men. Why did I split this out by gender at this point? It turns out that the picture is very different for women. If you now compare Black women to white women, notice that the spectrum of colors that you see in the map on the left and the map on the right look basically the same. And more broadly, when we look at lots of different measures, we see that once we control for socioeconomic class, Black and white women starting out in families at the same income level, you see pretty similar outcomes in terms of earnings, college attendance, and so forth between Black and white women. The really sharp racial disparities are emerging for men, and that's a useful lesson to keep in mind as you think about how to combat racial disparities going forward. It's particularly critical to understand why Black men are facing such disadvantages in the US. And you might think of issues related to criminal justice or discrimination that's particularly affecting men, and so forth. So to this point, I've been showing you broad geographic differences between different parts of the US, different cities in the US, and so forth. What I want to do next is zoom in and show you the data at a much more local level, which is going to help us further understand exactly what's driving these differences in economic opportunity. And in order to do that, I'm going to toggle over to this tool here, which is a website called the Opportunity Atlas that you can freely access yourself just by going to opportunityatlas.org. I'm going to start out with this national map, same map that we've been looking at. But the way this tool works is you can enter any street address that you want, exactly like a Google map, and you can literally zoom in and look at the data at a much more local level. So I'm going to, given the audience, just type in Raleigh and literally zoom in here to the data for Raleigh, and you can see right here, North Carolina State University. And now what you're looking at here is the data at a census tract level. So we've constructed the same statistics for every census tract in America. A census tract consists of about 4,000 people. Think of it as a narrow definition of neighborhoods. And so the key thing that I want you to see in this slide is that the spectrum of colors that you're seeing on your screen in the Raleigh area are the same as the spectrum of colors that I was showing you at the national level. I haven't changed the color scale in any way. And so, what that's telling you is you can go from, these neighborhoods here over to these neighborhoods here. And it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility. So we see this pattern in Raleigh, we see this pattern in Charlotte, we see this pattern in New York City. In basically every city in America, the origins of differences in upward mobility are not across, very broad regions. It's not about differences in state level policy. It's not about differences across cities. No, it's actually about, often one side of the street versus another side of the street, or one school district versus another school district. And so that lesson, I think, is extremely important because it shows us that the origins of upward mobility are hyper-local. Now, in further analysis that we've done that I'm not going to talk about in detail here, just in the interest of time, we look at kids who move across different neighborhoods. And what we find is if you move at a younger age, say at birth or when you're 2 or 3 years old, to one of these blue-green colored areas shown on the map, you are much more likely to have a high level of earnings and much better outcomes measured in many different ways, health, educational outcomes, and so forth, compared to if you grew up in one of these red colored areas. Now, I emphasize that because what that tells us is that there's actually a causal effect of growing up in one of these places rather than another. It's not just that different types of people are living in different places. If I use methods like randomized experiments, assignment of vouchers to some families rather than others, and look at families who move randomly to these higher opportunity neighborhoods, we see their kids doing much better, especially if those kids move to those places at young ages. Okay, so the key takeaway here is that where you grow up really seems to matter. And in particular, the particular block you're growing up basically really seems to determine your life outcomes in an important way. So coming back then to the slides, a natural next question you might have, having seen this very granular variation in upward mobility in different parts of Raleigh, you might ask, well, what is it about the places where we're seeing kids do better in the long run? So as a first step towards answering that question, in this slide here, I'm summarizing the strongest predictors we found of differences in upward mobility across neighborhoods. There are lots of different factors that economists and sociologists have thought about over the years. I'm summarizing here the 4 strongest correlations that we find. So first, we find that places that have lower poverty rates, so more mixed income neighborhoods, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility across generations. Second, we find that places with more stable family structures, so for instance, more 2-parent families, tend to be places that have higher levels of upward mobility as well. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools measured in various ways, expenditures per student, the size of classes, the quality of teachers, they also tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Finally, we find that places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Now, social capital is a term that people talk about a lot and is something that's traditionally thought to be potentially important for lots of different things. It's proved to be very difficult to measure systematically. So, what exactly is social capital? How do we measure it in the data has been quite challenging. The way I think about it is the extent to which you're connected to folks from different backgrounds who might help you out. So as a low-income person, might you be connected with higher income folks or people who might be able to give you job opportunities or information or connect you to a college that's going to change your life? And in some ongoing work that we're going to be releasing in about 3 months, we're using large-scale data from the biggest social networks in the United States to measure social capital in a very granular way, zip code by zip code, for every place in America, for every college, for every high school. And while I'm not able to share those results at the moment, I'll just preview and say those measures turn out to be some of the strongest predictors of economic mobility that we've found to date. And they will be publicly available, usable for policy and research purposes. And I'm hoping will really give us a lens to understand the power of social capital and how to improve social capital going forward, which strikes me as a key area of focus. So with that research background, I want to spend the last 10 minutes here talking about how you can take these research findings and think about actually changing policy to improve upward mobility. So in a nutshell, what I think we've learned, and I've given you kind of a whirlwind overview, but broadly what we've learned from a series of studies in our research group and many others, is that the roots of upward mobility are hyperlocal. Where you grow up within a half-mile radius of your house really seems to matter in determining your life outcomes. And it's kind of environmental conditions from birth until you're something like 22 or 23 years old that really seem to be determinative of lifetime trajectories. So when you have that view of the world, I think you would naturally think about 3 different ways to increase economic mobility. The first is to reduce segregation. If I see that some parts of Raleigh give kids better opportunities to rise up than others, then you might ask, well, why don't we just help more low-income families move to those blue-green colored parts of the map to the higher opportunity neighborhoods, essentially trying to desegregate the city. And so that's one approach we might take. A second approach, recognizing that you can't possibly move everyone and not everyone wants to move to a different neighborhood, is to bring opportunity to people rather than bringing people to opportunity. So can you make place-based investments to turn the red-colored areas into blue-green colored areas? Finally, recognizing that after the key touch point for most kids after they're 18 years old is not the home in which they're growing up, but rather the institution of higher education that they're attending. I think there's a big role for institutions like NC State and others to play in amplifying the impacts of colleges on upward mobility. So let me say a little bit on the type of work we are doing in each of these spaces to try to increase mobility going forward. So I'll start with the reducing segregation approach. And here I'm going to take you to Seattle, where we're doing some work on the ground with the local housing authorities to try to increase moves to opportunity and desegregate the city. So what I'm showing you here is, again, a snapshot from the Opportunity Atlas, where you see that familiar pattern of sharply different colors across different neighborhoods. And what we've done here is overlaid in the bright green dots the most common locations where families receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. Now, you might know that we spend about $45 billion per year on affordable housing programs in the United States, the largest component of which are housing vouchers that provide rental assistance to more than 2 million families to rent housing wherever they would like. One of the goals of this program is to give families access to higher opportunity neighborhoods that might ultimately break the cycle of poverty. But what you're seeing in this map is, unfortunately, the policy is not necessarily working as intended, right? If you look at where families receiving these vouchers are actually living, they're still concentrated in the red and orange colored parts of the map rather than the blue-green colored parts of the map. And so what that means is you're not actually breaking the cycle of poverty, despite the fact that these families are receiving these vouchers, because kids are growing up in neighborhoods where we see, based on the analysis we've done, they don't have great chances of rising up. So teaming up with the King County and Seattle housing authorities, we asked, why is this happening? Is it that families have a strong preference to live in these neighborhoods because maybe it's close to their job or to their families or it's familiar to them? Or is it that there are barriers that are preventing families from moving to higher opportunity areas? And maybe if we knock down those barriers, we would be able to create more moves to opportunity. So what we did is designed a randomized trial to help families with housing vouchers move to higher opportunity neighborhoods if they wanted to. And the key elements of that program were to give families customized search assistance. So think of it as basically a broker or counselor who would help you find housing where you want. We also connected folks with landlords to recruit them to the program to make it easier to find a unit where they'd like. And we gave a little bit of short-term financial assistance to pay for security deposits, fees, things like that. And so we ran this as a randomized trial. 1,000 people came in to apply for vouchers through the standard process. Half of the families got randomly allocated to receive these additional services. Half of the families in the control group got the standard program of just getting the voucher without this additional support. And so being a randomized trial, you can just compare where families decided to move in the control group versus the treatment group. The control group, you can see that only 14% of families moved to high opportunity areas, areas in the top third of the distribution in terms of economic mobility within the Seattle area. In contrast, in the treatment group, that number jumped up to 54%. More than half of the families ended up moving to high opportunity places where we estimate on average, their kids will go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes as a result of making this move. Now you can see very clearly how this played out in this map here, where we've shown in the shaded blue colors, the high opportunity parts of Seattle. The red pins show you where the families in the control group decided to move. The green pins show you where the families in the treatment group decided to move. And you can see that we've basically shifted through this very simple, relatively inexpensive treatment of providing some additional support in the search process where families decided to move. You've got distinctly more families in the treatment group living throughout these high opportunity areas, effectively desegregating Seattle to some extent. So that result received significant attention and is now being scaled up by the federal government. There was this act passed, a demonstration, Housing Choice Voucher Mobility Demonstration Act, that authorized about $70 million to replicate what we did in Seattle in cities across the country, 9 other cities. And there is now discussion of expanding the housing voucher program permanently by about $5 billion per year in light of this sort of evidence to give more kids access to higher opportunity neighborhoods through providing this sort of support and increasing the set of families who receive these vouchers. I should also note that it's not just about vouchers. That's not the only tool that we can use to desegregate cities. This type of work also has important implications for other tools that we can use for desegregation. So here's an example from Charlotte, expanding multifamily zoning, where changing zoning laws can dramatically change affordability of certain neighborhoods for lower income families, and thereby also increase access to economic opportunity. So that illustrates concretely how there are a number of changes underway that could, I think, have a significant impact on access to opportunity for many families and potentially change many kids' life outcomes quite substantially. But coming back to where I was before, I want to emphasize that this moving to opportunity, reducing segregation, affordable housing approach is just one tool in our toolkit and is by no means the only approach that we should be trying to take, because it's also important to understand how to revitalize the communities where opportunity is currently lacking. Now on that front, work is, I think, at an earlier stage in terms of understanding exactly what types of interventions can be effective in increasing economic opportunity in a given place. I'm just going to show you, to give you a preliminary sense of how we're thinking about these issues. I'm going to talk about some examples of the types of programs here, drawing on some work we've been doing in collaboration with folks in Charlotte to think about this life course approach to place-based investment. And just point out the wide spectrum of programs that people are trying to implement targeted at kids of different ages, from pre-K programs to programs in schools that are related to mentoring, to college advising, to workforce training programs targeted at young adults to give better pathways to higher paying jobs. And so what I think we need to do is systematically evaluate using the type of longitudinal big data that I've been talking about. What are the causal effects of each of these programs to really understand how we can bring opportunity to a given place. Just to give you one illustration of that, one program that we're spending a lot of time studying is a job training program called Year Up, where kids, young adults, typically in their early 20s who may not have finished high school, for example, or have a GED, they are enrolled in a program for about a year that gives them 6 months of mentoring and then a 6-month internship paired with an employer, say like Bank of America in Charlotte. And again, in randomized trials, the set of folks who were given access to this program in the treatment group, you can see they have dramatically higher earnings sustained over time relative to the folks in the control group who didn't have access to that program. And so I think these types of targeted workforce training programs that pair young adults with specific employers have now a proven record of success. And that's something that we can bring to many places that currently lack opportunities for youth. I want to briefly mention, given the setting we're in here at NC State, the final branch of how we can increase upward mobility through the tools of higher education. And to do this, I'm going to talk about a different set of data that we've constructed, also publicly available, showing you statistics on upward mobility for every college in the United States. So in the same way that we've constructed that data for every neighborhood in America, for every college in America, we've publicly released, and you can easily access through a tool created by the New York Times, data on economic mobility for every college in America. And so the way we think about mobility by college is on 2 dimensions. First, on the vertical axis, what I'm going to call the upward mobility rate. What fraction of students starting out in low-income families, say in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, make the leap to the top 20%? So to take an example, where I am here at Harvard University, Harvard looks great in terms of the outcomes of low-income kids. Low-income kids who come here do very well. But what matters for economic mobility is not just how low-income students on your campus do, but how many low-income students you have on campus to begin with. And on that dimension, Harvard does not do very well. Only something like 3% of kids come from families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, turning here to the horizontal axis. And so what we're showing here is 1 dot for every college in America, highlighting some colleges in the North Carolina area, including NC State, where you can see in our data, about 4.5% of kids come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution, 32% of them reach the top 20%. So NC State looks pretty good in terms of rates of upward mobility for the low-income kids on campus, but does not have all that many low-income kids on campus at present, especially relative to other colleges out here. Say, take comparison, New York, the City University of New York is serving far more low-income kids on average. And so when you look at these data, you see kind of this crescent-shaped pattern where there are relatively few colleges that both are serving lots of low-income kids and have pretty good outcomes. And so I think the key question for Harvard, or a place like NC State for that matter, is how you basically move to the right on this chart. How do you increase access for kids from low-income families so they can take advantage of the fact that there are pretty good outcomes from graduating from these universities? Conversely, for places like Central Piedmont Community College, which are serving many low-income kids, the question is how you improve the program, increase retention rates, reduce dropout rates, and so forth, to increase rates of upward mobility on those campuses. And so we are currently focused on trying to understand that, collaborating with many universities across the United States, and we'll have more work coming out on that in the years to come. So let me wrap up by recognizing that we're at a very unique moment in America here in the world, in the midst of an unusual pandemic. And so when I speak about these issues, people often ask me, well, what implications does the pandemic have for economic opportunity from this kind of longer term perspective that you've been studying it? And so when the pandemic hit, in our team, we started to try to study that more systematically. And I just want to give you one glimpse that illustrates the theme of what we're seeing. So this is data from a platform called Zearn, which about 1 million students use in the United States to complete math lessons as part of their regular school curriculum. We're breaking out this data here by income quartile, by family income quartile, and looking at the number of math lessons that kids completed right around the time that the pandemic hit in March of 2020. And so what you can see here is that when the COVID-19 came to the US and schools went remote, the number of math lessons that kids were completing fell very rapidly, but it bounced back almost immediately for kids in high-income families. Whereas for kids in low-income families, there was a tremendous reduction that persisted and persisted even into the next school year, such that even now, you see something like a 20% gap in the math lessons that kids from low-income families are completing, especially when schools go remote, relative to kids from higher income families. Now, 20% gap, that's like you're going to school one day less per week than kids from high income families. And given all the issues that I've talked about in the past half hour, what this suggests is this early childhood disparity that's widening is going to only amplify the importance of the issues that we've been talking about. And unfortunately, I think exacerbate our challenges going forward in terms of increasing upward mobility. So let me come back then to that chart that I started out with on the fading American dream. At some level, this might seem like a very somber note to end on. We've got a country where opportunities for upward mobility have been steadily declining over the past half century. And if anything, given this pandemic, are likely to worsen. But I look at things from a somewhat more optimistic perspective. If you think about the point at which we started to achieve these very high rates of upward mobility and inclusive growth in the United States, it was coming out of essentially what was the biggest crisis of the last century, the Great Depression, that led to fundamental changes in US national policy and changes in communities across the United States that set the stage for decades of inclusive growth in this country. And I think similarly, we're at a critical point in time where we now have the data and the science to understand what types of changes can really have an impact going forward. And I think all of you who are in the audience are incredibly well positioned to make a big difference going forward in North Carolina and across the US. I very much look forward to supporting you in those efforts. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We'll now open it up for questions from the audience, and Sherry and I will pass the mic.
I'll go, Karen. Thank you so much for your engaging talk. I was wondering, you mentioned looking at job markets, but did you look at the decrease in the number of unions and also, the right to work states? Also, I was wondering whether you looked at the decrease in pensions and, bear with me, the participation in military. Does it help being enlisted in terms of lifetime opportunity? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. These are all important factors, of course, in determining people's outcomes. Maybe surprisingly, when you look at things like right to work or unionization, there's some evidence that you find correlations in certain places, but it doesn't appear to be the determinative strongest factor. And one way that you could see that if you looked at the maps that I was showing you is a lot of the variation was coming at a much more local level than, right to work is determined at the state level, exactly like you said. Most of this variation is occurring at this, within cities. And so it's not going to be something like right to work at the state level that's driving the differences in upward mobility that we're seeing. On the military question, yes, I think the military can potentially be a pathway to upward mobility for some kids. And in particular, actually, it turns out there's some nice work showing that the specific military base that people get assigned to ends up affecting their kids' later outcomes, partly because it affects the environment they're growing up in. Of course, things like opportunities to access education through the support that's provided to veterans can also be very valuable. So, I think all of these factors matter. In terms of determining the overall picture, I think some of the other things that we were talking about seem more predictive overall.
Hi, thanks for a fantastic talk. I really appreciate the solutions and innovations that you've done to make a difference for communities. One factor that I was curious about is healthcare and access to healthcare. A lot of the states where you're seeing that downward mobility have not adopted Medicaid expansion, and it might be too soon to see what type of effect that could have, but just Wondering if you could speak to access to healthcare.
Absolutely. So there's some really good evidence from Janet Curry at Princeton and a number of others showing that early childhood investments in healthcare can have incredibly large payoffs. So kids who have prenatal care, access to better care in their youngest years, I think you see really significant causal impacts on later outcomes. And importantly, a lot of those investments look like they pay for themselves in the sense that there's a significant program expenditure for the federal government on providing health insurance, say. But then if you look at the improvement in health outcomes and the improvement in earnings that people have down the road, the additional tax revenue that the government gets more than offsets that upfront initial cost in many cases. So I absolutely think healthcare, especially targeted at young kids, can be incredibly valuable.
Question. So you're here in Wake County, and Wake County Public Schools actually implemented these things 20 years ago, where they had the system to ensure that none of our schools had more than a 40% poverty rate. And so it was a great system, it was a national model, and it was disbanded for political reasons. Okay. So, this is awesome, but I'm sort of curious as to white people aren't going to give up the privilege of the best colleges. They're not going to give up the privilege of the best schools and the best neighborhoods. So it seems like it's in a vacuum. We're here where we solved it. We solved the problem. And now we're in a downward trend.
No, very fair point. And, that's obviously a very important challenge to think about. Let me say two things. I think first, my view is bringing this type of data out clearly where, as you say, from your own experience that you saw something on the ground that really seemed to solve the problem. I think being able to show that systematically with data on a large scale, in my experience, some of the policy impacts that I was showing you at the federal level that have bipartisan support, I think there can, even in this polarized environment, there can be some impact of trying to show just systematically how these differences really matter. When you have more integrated communities without very high poverty rates, you do see better outcomes for kids. I think showing that kind of thing systematically does create some support for change. Furthermore, I think you're absolutely right that at the individual level, there can be political resistance from groups that feel like, I want my kids to do well. And so why should I be supportive of something, I care about the social good, but I care, maybe more about my own kids. That's perfectly rational for any one person to have that view. I would offer this, not that it's necessarily going to change people's minds, but when we look at the data, you can ask, do mixed income neighborhoods, we've seen poor kids do better there. Are high income kids hurt by growing up in mixed income neighborhoods? The answer actually turns out to be no. If you look in our data at more mixed income areas and look at the outcomes of kids from high income families, they are no worse than outcomes in very wealthy areas. And so what that suggests to me as a social scientist is a very important asymmetry where we can benefit kids in terms of coming up without hurting kids from higher income families. And that should, in principle, make this more palatable. Now, getting that message out there and solving the political problems, that's sort of above my pay grade. So I leave that to other folks.
Hi, could you say some more about the types of hyperlocal investments that could be made to change the conditions and make those neighborhoods more conducive to upward mobility? So you talked about building social capital. I'm interested in particular whether there's a role for sort of physical or natural environmental quality in those neighborhoods, and what else might be on your list of things to experiment with.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I mean, some things, that we've already touched upon, like trying to improve the quality of schools in specific areas, I think can be incredibly valuable. On social capital, you mentioned physical and environmental spaces, conditions as potentially being important. And indeed, we're trying to think about that more carefully. So I think urban planning issues, physical infrastructure, public transit, the extent to which people are able to access jobs or access opportunities all seem potentially important. I want to stop short of saying that we know for sure that certain kinds of interventions in that space will have significant causal effects, because I think we don't yet. But one of the things I'm going to be spending a lot of time on in the coming years, having seen what I've seen on the social capital data, which again should be publicly available soon, is the exact structure of spaces in which people are interacting, or like even the size of schools or the availability of parks or public spaces can shape interaction in important ways. And so I think thinking very carefully about those kinds of issues from a lens of mobility, which is maybe not traditionally the way people have thought about those kinds of questions, will be quite valuable going forward.
Yes, you have referenced programs designed to move high poverty children into areas of opportunity. You didn't address any kinds of programs that might be used to attract non-poor families into high poverty areas, which it seems very expensive to move people into high income areas and relatively inexpensive to move people into low income areas, since that's property value lower. Have there been any programs that have attempted to do that? And does gentrification concern get in the way of actually allowing that to even happen?
Yeah, excellent question. I think your intuition is absolutely right, that we could think about integrating neighborhoods in two ways. You could have lower income people move into higher income neighborhoods, or you could do it the other way around. And gentrification at some level, it's not a policy, but in effect can lead to that. I think the key question is, can you actually have a stable equilibrium where an area gentrifies and you don't just price out lower income folks and they end up having to move to a different neighborhood? So this reminds me a bit, for example, of a conversation I had with Jeff Canada in the context of the Harlem Children's Zone, where Jeff pointed out to me that the Harlem Children's Zone is shown to be incredibly successful in revitalizing Harlem, improving outcomes for kids there, for lower income kids. Well, Harlem's gentrified so much that his view is you're now not able to sort of help the people you originally intended to help because they've kind of gotten priced out of the neighborhood. So I think one key thing to keep in mind in the context of your question is, as you have gentrification, how do you sort of do gentrification right in a way that you still preserve affordability and maintain that integrated environment, so that you don't just completely tip the neighborhood and essentially shift folks to a different area. We are in the process of studying some major government neighborhood revitalization programs, like the Hope 6 demolitions, which sought to demolish major public housing towers and create mixed income neighborhoods that were in principle supposed to create better opportunities. And we're trying to understand when and how that works with this sort of longitudinal data. Don't have the answer yet in terms of what exactly the impacts are, but that's the type of thing I think that could potentially go in the direction that you're talking about.
Hey, so actually adjacent to the gentrification question, but an issue that North Carolina has right now is cost of living is skyrocketing. Have you seen any, I guess, data that looks at the cost of living versus the upward mobility in an area, and if that affects it at all?
Yeah, so I think the intuition that if costs of living go up such that families that could afford to send their kids to good schools, live in neighborhoods that provided good opportunities, effectively get priced out, and that creates more segregation, that's definitely going to be detrimental for upward mobility. But cost of living can work in multiple ways, right? Cost of living can go up at the same time that wages are going up. And in particular, if you see wage growth at the bottom of the income distribution, then it's possible that you basically are in the same place with higher prices. People are getting paid more, they have to pay more for things as well, but they're more or less able to access the same set of resources that they were before. So I think it's really important to understand not just cost of living on average, but how it's hitting in different parts of the income distribution. And of course, the push towards preserving affordable housing and things like that is related to a desire to combat cost of living increases that are particularly hitting people at the bottom end of the income distribution.
Well, thank you so much for your informing presentation. And my question is, for those who are making under the $7,000, which is 25 lower percentile, but also people just above, one notch above, but below the medium income level. So I'm wondering whether those are one notch above groups showed same patterns of like mobility. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, absolutely. I focused on that one measure, people at 27,000, not because there's anything particularly special about that particular threshold, but because it's representative of what happens for low and middle income families in general. So the basic way I would summarize it is if you're from a lower income family, the lower you are in the income distribution, the more it matters where you grow up. We see lots of differences in outcomes across neighborhoods, across cities, and so on. As you get richer, basically, if you're extremely rich, it looks in the data like it doesn't matter that much where you live. Your outcomes are pretty good if you're growing up in Charlotte, if you're growing up in Salt Lake City, if you're growing up in different neighborhoods. As you move down in the income distribution, it starts to matter more and more, and it's kind of a continuous process. There's no one threshold below which, certain factors start to matter a lot. It all looks kind of similar for people at the 25th percentile, the 30th percentile, the 40th percentile, but to a lesser and lesser extent, such that when you become very high income, local factors just seem less predictive of your outcomes in general. One way to think about that is you're kind of immune from local conditions. If you're in the top 1% of the income distribution, you can send your kids to a private school, you're connected in various ways, you're not dependent on local circumstances.
Are there any other questions? Very good.
Yes, so this is my next bonus question here. There are some states around the country that in West Virginia in particular, they've recently implemented a statewide school voucher program. Would you expect that to have any impact on a disproportionate impact on these low income communities, or is there any reason to think it would matter at all?
Yeah, so school vouchers are an interesting, potential alternative to the housing vouchers that I was describing.
It is a non-means tested. In other words, the richest person in the state can get it. So it's different from those that exist.
I see, yes. So, well, a couple different issues there then. So, when it's not means tested, I think part of what you're getting at is you can really erode the funding base for certain schools if everybody starts to use their vouchers in certain areas. And we've seen some evidence, actually studies done in North Carolina, where even if everyone's eligible, rates of take-up and the way families use these kinds of vouchers really vary with income, where higher income folks are more focused on getting their kids to the right schools and so forth, and that can actually exacerbate inequality. A different aspect of what you're asking about connects to some of what I was talking about earlier is to what extent can you replicate the benefits of living in a different neighborhood from simply sending your child to a different school? And I think the answer there is you can't get fully there as best we can tell. And part of it comes back to social capital and actually being integrated into the new environment. So when kids are bused, for example, to a different school, there's some evidence that the extent to which they actually interact with kids from a different background, which is what seems to be very predictive of later success, is lower than if their family actually lives there and they actually belong to that community. So my take on it basically is that there might be a role for school vouchers. I think one has to be very careful with the tax base and means testing issues as you're touching upon. I don't think they replicate, they're like a perfect substitute for the set of things we've been talking about here about investing in places, helping families move to better areas and so on.
That was our last question, and so I'll just ask everyone to join me in thanking Dr. Raj Shetty for an inspiring keynote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.